Liberalism, but just an analytical book and not saying anything about what we can do to counter the rise of nativism is not enough. So let's have a couple of chapters on what to do. So there are 2 chapters on hope at the end of the book, and that's I never did before. So I'm not a normative scholar in that sense. I try to be as analytical and distant, but I do actually, over time he convinced us that that would be an addition to the book. So and then he became even almost a co-author. The book is mostly on the Netherlands, but as you will see during my presentation, I will try to make comparisons, at least with other European countries, mostly France, but also the US is quite present in the book. And given that we are in the US, the second half of my presentation will raise the question whether what we describe as the rise of nativism in many Western European countries is also happening in the US. I hope you find the US interesting, because I know many of you are Europeanists, but nonetheless, we do the comparison at the end, if that's okay with you. The main argument of the book actually is very simple. Yes, we do have Islamophobia in Western Europe. Yes, we do have anti-Black racism, and yes, we do have populism, but they share a core, and the core is nativism. And I will explain that, but it is so, for instance, anti-Islam is not a religious dispute among Christians and Muslims, but it is about whether or not Islam is compatible with Dutchness, right? So it's all the time whether it's Dutch or French or British or German. And I will show that for the 3 types of exclusion that are quite predominant in Dutch society. But it is for sure not. What do I do? Oh. The laptop.
Give you
Well, I can just okay.
the keyboard, or I can do it.
Okay, let's do it. Next slide. Yes. Well, probably for most of you, nothing surprising there, right? It is the European Union, and it shows the vote for the radical right, the strength of nativist parties. Actually, it is rather recent, but there are new elections, and there the rise of the parties of the radical right is even more clear. And since this is the European Union, Britain is not in there, but obviously, right, Brexit and UKIP and the debate in Britain regarding leaving the EU was extremely nativist. So there's more to say about it, but it is important to realize that probably you all know that, right? How strong the rise of the radical right is. And the political landscape basically in almost all countries has changed in the sense that it is not the left and the right, but we now have the radical right, the right and the left. But that means obviously an enormous shift to the right, the radical right. In full. Next slide. I don't like definitions too much, but perhaps it's good to start briefly with our definition of nativism, and I come also back to some of these aspects. So what is nativism? Inspired by the American historian John William, we define nativism as an opposition to an internal minority that is seen as a threat on the grounds of its foreignness. The foreignness is important because some of you might know William said foreigners, but we think it is about foreignness, and I come back to that. The main opposition here is between foreignness and nativeness. Foreignness refers to people, practices, or ideas deemed to come from elsewhere. It refers to people who are here but not from here, to those who are in the place but out of place. Foreigners, aliens, strangers. Nativeness refers to people, practices, and ideas who primordially belong to the soil. Those who are of the place, indigenous and autochthonous. And I mention indigenous, and I do that intentionally, because actually in our definition, also discussions about indigeneity fit, right? Because indigenous people also felt threatened by an incoming minority, which was often the colonizers, an extremely powerful minority. But in that sense, the definition is not normative, but it's analytical, right? It is describing a situation in which the majority, powerful or powerless, in the case of indigenous people, feel threatened by an internal or incoming minority. What turns nativeness into nativism, and that's the other central element that constitutes nativism, is the perception that foreign forces pose a threat to the native population. Next slide, please. Yeah, I'm not sure how many of you know much about the Netherlands. Normally, I would say the Dutch case is not interesting, and I wouldn't work on the Netherlands because I'm Dutch myself. But in the case of nativism and the rise of nativism, the Netherlands is really a radical, exemplary case. I come back to that. This is Geert Wilders, the leader of one of the radical right parties, the biggest actually. And he is the autocratic leader of that party. You cannot even become a member of it. But he has been the second party in parliament for many years at this moment. So the argument is that there are several types of nativism. The most prevalent flavor of nativism clearly is what we call religious nativism, which portrays Islam and Muslims as a threat because then they think that Muslims allegedly fundamentally differs from national and European cultures. At the center of these cultural antagonisms are, perhaps surprise, surprise, gender equality and sexual freedom, tolerance, particularly tolerance for homosexuality. The Islam is reduced to its most radical version and depicted in terms of full oppression and backwardness, while Dutchness is seen as the embodiment of liberalism and secularism. Whether the differences concern politics, culture, or religion, the underlying opposition is always between modernity, we, and backwardness, them, the Muslims. Particularly interesting is the fact that Christianity plays an important role, but in a very confusing or ambivalent way. Whilst real existing Christianity in the Netherlands is mostly ignored in political debates, even though we still have quite a core group of Orthodox Protestants, but they are not, in that sense, visible in political debate, because that group doesn't fit our liberal self-image of the Dutch. Another version of Christianity is increasingly instrumentalized in nativist discourse. Christianity not as a religion in terms of confessional identity and practice, but as a general and rather vague heritage and cultural identity. In this self-image, what we call cultural Christianity, Christianity goes hand in hand with secularism and liberalism. Glossing over, let's be clear about that, but that's nothing new, a long history of conflict, of course, between the secular and Christian. And just to give one example, yeah, I wrote down here a funny example, but I don't know if it's funny actually. But one example, the Christian Democratic leader, or the leader of the Christian Democratic Party, Buma, claimed in 2017 during the election campaign that gender equality has been a Christian tradition for thousands of years, which is quite special to say, right? And actually, of course, for us, the question is then, how is it possible he thinks that is true, right? Why would he come up with the idea that Christianity and feminism or gender equality has been, well, going hand in hand for thousands of years, which obviously is totally untrue in all countries, particularly in the Netherlands, which was an extremely conservative country till the 1960s, 1970s, one of the most conservative in Europe. Right? And we still have actually rather traditional gender relations in the Netherlands as an heritage of what happened before. But that he thinks that it is part of this Christian democratic Christian heritage shows that it is about what he thinks that Dutchness is about, right? And that is the main argument. So the first argument, if you think about anti-Islam, anti-Muslims, it is not, as I said, right, a religious dispute. It is really all the time about the question, are Muslims Dutch? Can Muslims ever be Dutch? Is Islam and Dutchness compatible? Or is it incompatible? And Wilders will say it is compatible and it will be compatible forever, right? So that is radical nativism. or nativist, religious nativism. Next slide. Racial nativism, and sorry for the black-faced figures, but I have to explain what's going on there because that's still happening in the Netherlands. Racial nativism is another type of nativism revolving around issues of racism and demographic shifts between white Europeans and racial others. The nativist discourse on Black Pete, and there the helper of St. Nicholas is called Black Pete. He was the servant of St. Nicholas. Is very much a case in point. The anti-racists who criticize this Dutch blackface tradition of Black Pete are regarded by nativists as a threat to the Netherlands, as a threat to the Dutch heritage, because this is a tradition and culture that goes back for centuries. Not only are the anti-racists blamed for creating division and hatred instead of national unity and celebrating traditions, but more particularly because their anti-racism is racist towards white people. That's the argument, right? The same arguments, of course, are used against Black Lives Matter movements. Nativists perceive all affirmative action policies related to diversity and inclusion and anti-racism as anti-white racism. In other words, anti-black racism is interpreted both as an assault on Dutch culture, how dare those foreigners criticize our tradition, and as reverse racism. Perhaps to elaborate on that, there was a huge debate, and actually this racist tradition is disappearing. So in most villages and towns in the Netherlands, the Black Pete figure is not welcome anymore, right? So that really changed in the past 15 years. So there you can say in a normative way that there is hope. But what was striking in the debate was that white Dutch people supporting this figure said, well, why are Dutch black citizens participating in this debate? Because it is our tradition, as if Dutch black citizens were not black Dutch citizens against their will, being enslaved for more than 3 centuries, right? So it's extremely painful that then they were told that they could not participate in that discussion because it was a Dutch tradition, as if they were not Dutch. And all participants in that debate did have Dutch citizenship, also the black citizens. Obviously, a more radical version of racial nativism explicitly and often implicitly mobilizes replacement theories revolving around the idea that, whether intended or unintended, white Europeans will become in the near future a minority in Europe in the demographic race between non-whites from Africa and the Middle East. Metropoles like Amsterdam, London, Paris, and Berlin foreshadow the predicament of the continent as a whole. That racism and racial nativism have simultaneously become more explicit and normalized in public discourse does not mean that the taboo on racism has totally disappeared. Even racists don't want to be called racist, right? Whereas Wilders, being anti-Islam, is proud to be an Islamophobe, right? So there are differences there. But it causes, because they don't want to be labeled as racist, that they often use euphemisms like demographic changes instead of racial replacement, because that is too risky to write down. And Geert Wilders, well, he's not that subtle, but indeed, he also does not often directly attack Muslims, but he then says, well, I'm criticizing Islam, which I don't perceive as a religion, but as a certain type of ideology. Yeah. Actually, he did say, as some of you might know, at a certain moment, what do we want? We want less Moroccans. So that was very much about individuals, right? I mean, that's very much a very radical voice, clearly there. So this is the second example of that clearly the Netherlands has a big problem with anti-black racism, but to understand, it is important to acknowledge that it is not it is not an anti-black racism, it is a mixture and an entanglement of nativism and anti-black racism, because all the time the citizenship of black citizens is questioned. all the time the question is, are black people really Dutch? Can Dutch people be black? Right? I come back to that to make the comparison with the US, whether that's the case here as well. But in the Netherlands, it is in that sense, like France actually, it's very much about whether or not people can perceive black people as being Dutch and having Dutch citizenship. And well, the racism that came up during that discussion showed that for many Dutch people, that is quite an issue, and for them it is unimaginable. So it is nativist racism. That is the argument, right? So again, you have to understand it as colored by racism. Sorry, nativism. Next slide. We go to the third type of nativism, and I don't know whether you know him. He's Thierry Baudet. He's the leader of one of the other radical right parties. But it's interesting to have him there in his shoot because he's extremely elitist, but he's blaming the liberal elite. So he's taking a populist position, which is extremely interesting. And he cannot be attacked for being elitist because he is perceived by his own people as a true Dutch native. Whereas the liberal elite is perceived as not being Dutch, right? So there again, it is not economic populism where we are talking about, right? This is a form of populism that is mobilizing against the Dutch liberal elite in terms of their un-Dutchness, in terms of being cosmopolitan, in terms of betraying their own people by embracing or welcoming migrants. So again, it is not any form of populism, it's nativist populism. So yes, it has this aspect as all populism, that it's criticizing the elite, but it is criticizing a specific form of the elite. It is not the capitalist class or whatever, right? It is criticizing the liberal elite as being un-Dutch. And often there are anti-Semitic undertones, right? There about cosmopolitan elite, and then, well, all the people that are criticized in international discussions by the radical right. We also have the local variant, and anti-Semitism is never far away there. To come back to the definition that I introduced, perhaps you better understand why we talk about that they feel threatened by an internal minority because of their foreignness. Because obviously the Dutch liberal elite is Dutch, right? So they are not literally foreign, but they are perceived as foreign to the Dutch culture and betraying the Dutch culture. So therefore, we think you can better use foreignness than foreigners, because otherwise you cannot include and understand this nativist form of populism. Next slide, please. It is important to somewhat qualify it, right? To somewhat better understand this, because if you think about what the consequences of nativism are, we can become extremely pessimistic, because deep or radical nativism really actually claims that the group that is threatening the majority should disappear. Right? In the end, it is a very radical ideology. It's about those people don't belong here. They are not natives. They are non-natives, and they cannot become native, right? So the radical version is actually that people should disappear. And well, we know the historical examples of that, but also what Wilders said about Moroccans, right? It is indeed about, he doesn't want to have the Dutch Moroccans in the Netherlands. Well, they're already there, right? Since the 1960s. So that is quite something. So, but let's be perhaps also empirically more precise and think about gradations. Gradations, 4 types of gradations. I will be very, very brief about that. So yes, the Dutch elite is perceived as foreign, but obviously it is more difficult to depict the Dutch elite as foreign than depicting Dutch Muslims or Dutch Black citizens as foreign. So there's a certain difference in degree there, the way, the degree to which a certain group can be depicted as foreign. The elite is slightly less foreign than Black immigrants or Black or Muslims. In terms of threats, well, obviously it makes quite a difference whether there is a political debate regarding whether or not people should speak the Dutch language also at home. Also, migrant families are expected to use the Dutch language. That is already quite something, right? But that is not to be compared with replacement theories, where the idea really is that we should have less black people because black people are taking over the country. So there again, there are topics of gradation that we have to take into account. And thirdly, there are degrees of exclusion, because the most radical version, in that sense, is extremely pessimistic. Muslims and black citizens will never be Dutch, whereas a more moderate position will say, well, at the moment they are not native, but in the long run they can perhaps become more native, right? So that is, of course, ideas of integration, and that is our more moderate versions, perhaps, of nativism, because in the long run people can become Dutch, and then Islam is not perceived as inherently incompatible to Western values. But for the moment, we do see this rather radical form of nativism and all the consequences thereof, very material consequences, right? So what I said, pleas for policies to decrease immigration, increase remigration, or to build a wall. Well, not something new to the ears of Americans. And fourth, it's important to ask oneself how dominant is the nativist upsurge, the nativist parties in parliament, and are mainstream parties also embracing or using the nativist frame. Well, as I said, in the book, we have a chapter on the left, and we looked particularly to an improbable case, so the green left, so the Greens. And we have to say that they often argue in favor of liberal values as such. So because they are liberal values and political liberal values, and we support those values, right? Gender equality, LGBTQI, etc. But sometimes also the Green left leader felt forced, I think, to start using a more nativist discourse and saying, well, I do embrace those values because they are Dutch values. And he was attacking the others who were more critical regarding those values and telling them that they were un-Dutch. So, and that happens in US politics a lot, that there is the blame game whether or not people and their behavior can be perceived as being French, German, British, American, or Dutch. And the moment the frame of nativism becomes dominant, it is extremely difficult to not use that same frame because you're just not part of the discussion anymore. And I do emphasize that because becoming older, I realized that when I was young, we had a lot of political discussions in the Netherlands, but it was never about Dutchness, never, ever actually. Whereas for my students now, they are so used to the idea that things have to be discussed in terms of being American or being French or being German. But that's actually rather recent. That might be different in the US, but it is in many European countries actually rather recent. And we almost forget that because we get so used to such kind of frame that we think that it is normal that all kinds of political debate are narrowed down to the question whether or not it is Dutch or non-Dutch, right? And one can say, yeah, but perhaps it's not so problematic that people embrace liberal values because they are Dutch, because then there's a lot of support for liberal values. But I can tell you that it's actually quite risky if that is the reason why those values are embraced. Because the moment they think, oh, but actually those values are not so Dutch, there won't be much support for those values. And that's what we see happening nowadays with the radical right. I can't elaborate on that now. We can perhaps come back to that during the Q&A. But we do see actually that some of the more radical right parties now really become conservative and are not supportive anymore for topics like gender equality and so on. Before I come to the US case, two more general points. First, what I would call irony of the past. Nativism relies on idealized images of the past, portraying the native population in terms of racial purity, cultural sameness, and communal harmony. which again in the Dutch case is extremely bothering because, as you might know, our country, my country, was not harmonious at all, was not homogeneous at all, because there was almost an equilibrium among the numbers of Roman Catholics and Protestants. People lived in pillars and didn't have any interaction, and it was unimaginable that a Roman Catholic guy would marry a Protestant boy. Unimaginable. So when I heard the stories by my parents, so very recent, the country was heavily divided, and the Protestants were, what do you say? If you don't like a Roman Catholic, you are. There's a word for that. Sorry.
Anti-papist.
Yeah, anti-Papist. These kind of sentiments were very present, actually. And that all changed in the 1960s and 70s, right? But that's very, very recent. Until then, the country was like, it was not like Northern Ireland. We were close to Northern Ireland, I would say. So the opposition between the pillars was quite incredible. But of course, we are rewriting history now. And now everybody's saying, oh, the Dutch were so peaceful and all white and all together. It obviously was then not so much true. But there was another rewriting of history there as well, because more recently, the newest radical right party is called a farmers' party, and they very much polarize the, let's say, rustic rural life, this metropolitan urban life, multicultural and so on. And there is a double irony at play here. Former colonizing nations in Europe, such as the Netherlands and France, experience people from former colonies and other non-European regions as colonizers, threatening white native populations. And the second irony is that the same nativists who see themselves part of an anti-colonial struggle against the invasion of multicultural ideas and people still defend, glorify, and romanticize their own colonial past, right? So it is a quite confusing amalgam of ideas. Briefly on liberalism, the functioning of liberalism in nativist discourse is highly ambivalent. On the one hand, liberalism is seen as a defining essence of Western civilization, rendering it superior to backward illiberal nations. At the same time, when liberalism is pushed too far, multiculturalism, wokeism, the nativist position regarding liberalism changes from a defining feature of superior identity to a threat to the nation's tradition and culture. For nativists, the end justifies the means. Because the natives need to defend themselves, it's justified to selectively use and dismiss liberal ideas. Well, what does the last part of the presentation, what does it mean? What can we learn from the Dutch case? Our argument in the book is actually a lot, because the Dutch case, we thought, was a rather improbable case, given that the Netherlands, perhaps also by you, were always perceived as a multicultural, tolerant, and progressive country. Well, I'm not going to discuss that we, I think, actually never had multicultural policies, but for sure not anymore these days. It's all pushing monoculturalism. But progressive, yes, but not tolerant anymore. And that is quite a puzzle. But it shows us that progressive people can be highly intolerant, right? So progressive people can be intolerant towards those who don't share in their liberal ideas. And that is what we see in many European countries happening. So it is an improbable case, given that, if this is a kind of description of political liberalism, given the fact that the Netherlands was scoring high on those indicators of political liberalism. But obviously there are more countries that do embody traditions of liberalism, like France and like the US. So let me turn to my last slide, I guess. Well, this was about the Dutch, but the next slide is perhaps more interesting. Now, Trump is fading away, but actually he's not really fading away. Right? No, but here he is. So the question then would be, if we do the comparison with the US, what can we say about the probability that the rise and return of nativism that we perceive in Western Europe can be compared in one way or another to the situation in the US? In the literature, I think, if I may summarize, there are, but some of you have been writing about it extensively yourself, but there are two main arguments why the US will be less susceptible to thanks. Nativism, because the obvious argument, because the US is safeguarded by perceiving itself in those terms, given that it is an immigration country. And if you are an immigration country and almost everybody is an immigrant, well, then it is more difficult to talk about and perceive yourself as a native. Obviously, right, I'm not talking here about the true natives, but the immigrants themselves coming later and, doing all kinds of things to those who were the original inhabitants here. What happened then in terms of nativism? Well, I don't know whom of you read the book by Hayem, but he convincingly shows that there has been one wave of nativism after the other in the US. So the idea that you are a country of immigrants does not protect yourself to the rise and the sentiment of nativism. There can be much more said about that, but in general, that is a little bit too simple. It might help, right, when you perceive the country and you actively live that. For instance, New York has this campaign that we are an immigrant city and we are welcoming all the time. It might help that you become less nativist, but it is not really a safeguard. Secondly, what always has been mentioned, both for France and the US, obviously, is the jus soli tradition, right? So if you have jus soli citizenship, or more or less jus soli citizenship, that would help against nativism, because then everybody born on American soil will be American, right? So that is different than jus sanguinis, where clearly it's through the blood. And then the idea of being native to a certain group develops more easily than in jus soli citizenship tradition. Well, again, I would love if that would be true, right? But look at France. I mean, France has more or less still jus soli. And many of you might know the book by Brubaker, right? Comparing France and Germany very much in those terms of jus soli and jus sanguinis. And therefore he explained why it would be more easy for immigrants actually to become French than for Turks to become German. He has been critical regarding that book himself, so I can be critical. But that's obviously nonsense. It doesn't work like that. I mean, it would be wonderful if that would be the reality, right? Because then we would all be Republicans and embrace laïcité. But what we do see in countries that are so highly Republican, like France, is that anti-Black racism is the highest of Western Europe, right? And the struggle against Muslims, I mean, there's a daily struggle what girls can dress at schools, right? So it is far more complicated than that. And there is not just one thing that would protect us against the right of nativism. I think that actually that France is at least as worse as, if I may say it in a normative way, as the Netherlands in terms of the rise of nativism. So what then if I go through shortly, briefly, the three types of nativism I discussed. Anti-Black nativism, anti-Black racism. I did this presentation twice before, and I have to say, it looks as if Americans disagree among themselves. To what extent racism, anti-Black racism in this country is nativist or not? Some people will argue, well, no, the Americanness of Black people here is not really questioned. People are African-American, right? So they are American. Others will say, yeah, but these Black people still have a hyphenated identity. White people don't have that so much, right? They are just American. So at least the Americanness of Black people is more questioned. And some people seem to embody the core of Americanness. And then others will give the example of Trump questioning Obama's Americanness by the birtherism thing, which is perhaps not coincidental, right? That a Black candidate, is that possible? Is he really American? So I'm not the one who's going to judge this, but I would love to hear your ideas about to what extent anti-Blackness here is colored by nativism. My conclusion for the moment is that anti-Black racism, of course, is horrible here, but it is not as nativist as in Europe. And I don't know whether that makes it less worse, but I think analytically it's important to realize what kind of anti-Black racism is out there in order to fight it, right? You have to understand what is the core of that. Then American Muslims, there again, there are different positions in the US itself. Nancy Foner told me, listen, it is not so nativist as in Europe. Muslims are accepted, are part of American society, also because they are just a small group compared to that in Germany, France, and the Netherlands, right? The Muslim presence is, Muslims are like 10%, 50% of the population, so much more than in the US. And they were middle class, right? So that makes also a difference. They have a different economic position. There again, I think that is not always a safeguard, right? I mean, again, the history of anti-Semitism, we do know that actually numbers don't say much. There can be enormous anti-Semitism where barely any Jewish person is still living, right? So numbers are not always, doesn't always provide a clue, a strong explanation. And Jews, many Jews were extremely middle class, obviously, right? So that doesn't help because then they become attacked for being rich and elitist and so on. So it is, again, they're far more complicated. One could say perhaps, yeah, but overall in the US, there is more respect for religion in compared to highly secularized countries like the Netherlands, right? More than 50% of the Dutch don't have a faith anymore. So that's quite high compared to the US, for instance. So the position of religion is different. There are not that many atheists, growing group in the US, but still compared to other countries. So therefore, people have more respect for religion in general. And therefore, anti-Muslim wouldn't be so nativist. Americans also disagree about what exactly happened to Muslims after 9/11. Some will emphasize that actually, if you look at the reaction of President Bush, he immediately said, okay, those who attacked the Twin Towers, they were foreigners, right? But that all other Muslims in the US are Americans, right? So he immediately tried to include them and not to make it into a nativist Islamophobia. Well, there's disagreement, I think, how successful that has been, because quite some Muslims report that they did feel that others didn't perceive them anymore as American. But compared to Europe, I still think that Islamophobia is less nativist here than it is in Europe. Final remark, comparison, populism. How nativist is populism? How nativist is the radical right in the US? So then I'm not discussing economic populism, but again, right, so looking into how the elite is blamed in Washington. And then I think it's quite nativist, actually, because it's very much in terms of being un-American, right, all the time, alienated from the ordinary man, being cosmopolitan, serious, well, anti-Semitism there coming in. So I think actually, but of course, many of you have been writing about that the populism here, that strand of populism is highly nativist. And it is very difficult, for instance, for Democrats not to frame their discourse in nativist terms as well, right? In the sense that they have to argue as well that what the Republicans are doing is very much un-American. Of course, they don't say they have to disappear, so it is not a radical form of nativism, but the frame is all the time that the important issue like seems to be, are you American or are you not American? And to escape from that and to have discussions about all kinds of topics not related to the question whether you are a true national, whether you belong as a native, seems to be very difficult. So there, I think, final sentence, that populism in Europe and in the US is as nativist in both continents. Thanks.
Extremely stimulating talk, and I'm really glad I'm going to go my voice, or else I might dominate or say too much. But anyway, I can't say very much except to get down the lights of my eyes. I'm going to sort of handle the Q&A here. First, I'll give Jan Willem a moment to catch his breath and have some water here. And what I will do is I have to hook up to the, we have a quite an audience on Zoom too. And I want to give them the opportunity to, could you get me to the right now. Okay, there's nothing there. Okay, great. So anyway, I will what I will do is I will accumulate some names in order and then I'll take questions. So first I'm gonna get a list. David, who else? Okay, I don't know your first name, but Tari, okay. I saw Ken, I saw Peter. Anyone else? That's quite a bunch for the beginning. Okay, David, why don't you start?
Yeah, thank you, David Oaks, Hobart William Smith Colleges. Yeah, a couple of questions. The first one is something where you said maybe we'll get back into that into the discussion, because it seemed obvious from the beginning that the Dutch, like much of the other Nordic right, became radical right, but also distinguished himself against Islam by defending progressive values, right? Feminism, gender equality. But it always seemed also that was a ruse, partly a ruse, right? And partly way. So you just mentioned just what I was wondering, that there are new parties, or are there tendencies within Wilders' party to, shed that pro-feminism and go for the anti-feminist vote, which, as we've seen elsewhere in the West, is quite powerful. So I wonder if you say something about that. The other question is, in Netherlands, like elsewhere, working class historically aligned with the social democrats. Also, many of them went over to the radical right, on these, because defending welfare state for their people only. So how has the Social Democrats been fighting back against that? And finally, what do we know about the labor vote? Have workers really been moving, do we know, from that Social Democrats to the radical right? Thank you.
Can I just ask, does anybody have a question that piggybacks on that one? Okay, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the questions. Regarding the first, I don't know how much you know about, you know a lot about it, but whether other people know about how that developed in the Nordic countries, or countries that score very, very high on all kind of indicators that we have as social scientists, right? So, for instance, the Engelhard or whatever you want, FOSS material, things like that. And the Dutch are then part of the Nordic countries, indeed. And with quite outstanding numbers, right? So just to indicate that in the Netherlands, if you ask people, 94% of the people are in favor of gay marriage. So it's almost like the former communist country. It's really almost everybody, right? So some of the dividing lines in your country, but also in other countries, are just not there anymore. And then again, of course, after the 1960s, after the 1970s, that were in the Netherlands so much experienced as a total relief after the conservatism of those pillars. The idea was very much like, okay, now we have this very nice liberal country, and that is what Dutchness is about, right? So Dutchness becomes redefined in terms of gender equality, support for LGBTQI, freedom of speech, but that's basically what was perceived as Dutchness. So that made it for the upcoming radical right, but also for the center parties, the conservative liberals, the Christian Democrats, since the 1990s, almost impossible to be against those liberal values, which are slightly broader, right? It is not just about gender and sexuality, although it is surprisingly a lot about gender sexuality. It's also about the start and the end of life, right? It's also about abortion and euthanasia. But anyway, that spectrum of values and issues was embraced by many political parties, and partly I don't know whether we should say opportunistically or instrumentalized, but as I try to explain, then at least some of the people of those parties, particularly the radical right, were in favor of those values because they were Dutch. So no escape for them, they had to embrace those values. And what we do see more recently is that they say, yeah, of course, gay marriage is fine, a man marrying a man, a woman, because there is still a clear gender binary. But everything that gets into gender fluidity, non-binary, wokeism is as attacked and used against the left as in the US, France, Germany, well, everywhere almost. So the picture gets more diverse in the sense that particularly Baudet's party is attacking gender ideology all the time, is trying to stop that money is not given anymore to young people that want to change their sex, things like that. So that is almost as politicized, but the support is far smaller than in many other countries. I was slightly more optimistic than I am now. In the 1990s, early 2000s, we did research, and what we could show actually is indeed that it was not just the opportunistic behavior by the leaders of those parties, but that their supporters also became convinced of liberal values. So there was an enormous performative effect, what I found interesting. So it was not so much the bottom that was the grassroots that were radicalizing or becoming more liberal, and that was translated by the leaders. No, the leaders were like really leading in that sense. And then their constituency was more and more convinced that liberal values were a good thing. And I still think that there is this progressive support, but for some of them there are limits. And fighting against gender ideology is also quite profitable in the Netherlands, even not so much as in some of the other countries. The second question regarding social democrats. Yeah, there is quite some research also recently, and some of you are also specialists in this, that actually show that some people, working class people, have moved from social democrats to the radical right, but that is actually a rather limited group. So the very idea that social democrats are losing all their supporters, right? Because many social democratic parties are in big problems in many countries. Because of the radical right, there's a lot of empirical data out there that shows that is 10, 20% of their voters went to the radical right. Most voters went to the Greens, right? So it's really interesting to look into that and to see to whom they are losing votes. So not to downplay the problems of social democracy, because clearly voters have been moving to many other political parties, but also staying at home, right? So there's a lot to say about those who don't vote anymore and those who didn't vote anymore, but who are voting now for the radical right, right? So the radical right is profiting a lot from people who feel taken seriously again. That's also an interesting point, I think. And so at NIAS at this moment, we have a group working on the future of progressive politics. And that is a group of political scientists specialized in your question about what happened to social democracy and what then is the future of the left when social democratic parties are so much under pressure. In the Netherlands, we have a kind of experiment. We will have elections in November. And for the first time, we see a very close cooperation, almost a merger of the Social Democrats and the Greens. So there is something happening that is, I think, intellectually and electorally perhaps interesting to look at. So is that helpful? Does that work well for the left to somewhat recover? But it is hard to compare there among countries, obviously, right? Because we don't have your majority system. Speaking in terms of electoral systems, we have a proportional system, and we have 16 political parties in parliament. Yeah, so it's quite clever that the Greens and the Labour Party merge now, because now they are the first in the polls. And that hasn't happened for a long time, I have to say. But still, the left is very small in the Netherlands, 30% at most, perhaps. So what I described at the start, right, that it is the left, the right, and the radical right is still very much, or is even more true than ever. That the right and the radical right are about 65% of the votes. So that is quite something. And of course, you could qualify that because the right and the radical right in the Netherlands are perhaps like I don't know, some parts of the Democrats in the US, right? So it's not easy to compare, but nevertheless, it is, it's something.
Okay, Hari?
Yeah. Hi, thank you very much for your talk. Also interesting to hear as someone who is Dutch myself, which is also a funny thing to say in a talk about nativism. But I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about, like you mentioned, progressive, yes, but tolerant, no. And something that I always found interesting in kind of like political theory and also history of like how we view ourselves is around this word like of us being tolerant, because obviously like, you know, being tolerant of something is not the same as, you know, being accepting of something or supporting something. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about like progressiveness and that use of the word tolerant. Also because like what you were saying as well about like, you know, with the nativeness of like Dutchness, like going back as well and creating like narratives of Dutchness to like, you know, 17th century, like golden age in square quotes. You know, colonialism, like that is also something that is harkened back to also as an age, like as a historical period of like tolerance as well, where, you know, we were not as bad as the English or not as bad as, you know, the French with like, you know, religious liberalism. But also we were like, oh yeah, you know, you can have your own religion as long as I don't see it. So you know, so I'm kind of, yeah, and all around that like hinges on that word like tolerant or, you know, tolerance. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that.
Thanks for the question. I will try to be brief, but it is a vast question. And obviously on the one hand, it's very attractive, right? To think about one's own country in terms of that we have always been liberal, and since Spinoza we are liberal, so since the 17th century. And there was this American writer who wrote about Amsterdam, history of the most liberal city in the world, and very suggestive book, right? Very compelling, and I would love to believe it, but it is nonsensical. I mean, the Netherlands has been extremely conservative in the 18th and 19th century, the first half of the 20th century. As you said, right? I mean, Roman Catholics, well, they could be there, but their churches were not permitted to be visible from the outside for a long time. Jews didn't have the same citizenship rights. And tolerance regarding homosexuality was not existing at all, right? So it is a pity that it isn't true. But it isn't true, even though we need, of course, stories and myths about our country and about episodes and times and people that are inspiring. But the problem is the Dutch have a difficult relation to their past because they indeed think that it has been a glorious past. So the Dutch are, there was just a recent survey, 50% of the Dutch still think that colonialism was a good thing. And that is the highest in Europe. Because we have never that's not true. We are working on it, right? And there have been apologies for slavery, apologies for colonization to Indonesia. But it is late. And we cannot imagine that we have been wrong because we are progressive and liberal, right? So there is a psychological mechanism, collective psychological mechanism there. And it is in a state of denial, let's say, about how brutal Dutch colonization was, like everywhere, right? So nothing special about us there. And coming to our days, as some of you might know, in 2002, the then leader of the radical right party, Pim Fortuyn, was killed, terribly assassinated. And he was one of the first leaders of a radical right party. So radical right parties were developing in those days. And he was an openly gay man. And he said, listen, we are not going back to the dark days of the Netherlands. So he knew very well, at least in terms of sexuality and gender, that we were not progressive at all till the 1970s. But that touched on the thing like, okay, but does everybody have to agree with you on what people value in their life? Is the only way we can live together when we think that we are actually a homogeneous people? Can we live with differences? And I think actually that is at the heart of the discussion in the Netherlands, that we think that social cohesion is at risk when there is diversity. And embracing diversity and thinking about the value of diversity, but then in the sense that you respect things that you don't like, right? Because that's tolerance about, that you really disagree. Well, that is tolerance, of course, in its pure core. That is extremely difficult, or it is as difficult for progressive people as for conservative people. It is not particularly difficult for progressive people, but progressive people automatically think about themselves as if they are tolerant. And that's not often the case.
Thank you. Ken?
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. And I just want to follow up on the question of religion and the differences between the US and the West European cases, because I mean, I was struck by your account of how the far right, the nativist right is, sort of invoking the notion of a Christian heritage in a cultural sense, but not in a confessional sense. And that would make sense to me in a context of European societies that tend to, for the most part, are more secular than in the United States, where the percentage of believers and percentage of active churchgoers is much higher. And where the Christian nativism in the United States, which is very powerful and which does explicitly construct the United States in their understanding as a Christian society, as part of the founding. And my sense is that the Christian nativism in the United States is far more confessional, and consequently far more illiberal than what you were talking about in the European context, where you sort of reconstruct the Christian heritage so that it becomes compatible with liberalism. And I think what we see in the United States is very, very different, where we see a notion of Christian nationalism that, as I said, is very confessional and also strikingly illiberal. And so I'm just curious as to how you would see the differences in the US case from the European case.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have to add much. So we totally agree. Perhaps just to elaborate a little bit on the European case, because indeed I somewhat glossed over, perhaps I said just the terms cultural Christianity, but obviously it's not just about intentionally overlooking the differences between those who are not Christian, but then are absorbed in this idea that they are basically all living in Christian civilization, or a civilization that has indeed also is founded in Christianity, right? So that is one thing. Atheists, secularized people, and others. The difference is not so big in various ways, right? So basically saying we are still a Protestant culture, or we are a Christian culture, things like that. But also more specifically talking about Judeo-Christian, right? So also crossing over differences between Judaism and Christianity, and not talking about what happened in the 20th century at all, which is so surprising, obviously, that it is almost I sometimes it is so hard to understand how that can resonate, right? That you speak about Judeo-Christianity as if that is a peaceful history. I mean, that is so unimaginable. But still, it works, and it works in rather general terms, right? So it's about European civilization. It's not about European Union. It's about Greek-Roman civilization. It's not about the actual Greeks, right? Because they are terrible. But it's about Greek-Roman. So it's all very vague, but still very convincing, and successfully integrating all kinds of groups, ideas, traditions that basically don't go together. But in their idea of this cultural Christianity, which remains very vague and is rewriting history in various ways, it is successful. But I do agree that obviously here it is also a bigger group, I think, that really believes in that. And I just saw data by an article, I think by Phil Gorski, in which he shows, or others did it as well probably, like that it is creating a cleavage between Democrats and Republicans here, because the number of non-believer among Democrats is really, really rising very quickly. So up to 40%, I think now, which is, of course, for the US, that is really something, right? Then you get close to what many European countries are on average. I mean, here it is within one party, but it can create a deep cleavage, or even reinforce the cleavage that is already so much out there between Democrats and Republicans here. Because for Republicans, it is then unimaginable that people are atheists, right? Or are non-believers, whereas the Christian democratic parties in Europe are totally used to the fact that the majority, at least, or close majority, are atheists. Yeah. I hope that helps a bit. Yeah.
Just quick point, Americans don't think in terms of cleavages. This is a European discourse in the social sciences that Americans simply think in terms of sorting, as is called in American politics, but there's no familiarity with this European literature on social cleavages and whether or not religion or urban-rural divides or ethnic divides would actually be social cleavages. It's not thought of in the same way in the US.
Here, but anyway.
Peter.
Let me continue that line of thought. Looking at your chart there, I think America is blessed not to have European nativism because we had our own slavery system. We were lucky that way. So also it says each family is unhappy, each in its own way. So you structured your talk by creating the space for contingency through analytical, disaggregated the concept. But in your answers, and certainly in the comparison with the United States, it's really historical contingency which wins out. And the cleavage argument, which Ken just rightly said, this is not a category here, but it clearly is a category in Europe for Steinrock Kahn, but also for people who write on consociationalism.
Yeah.
So going to David's question about the working class, I mean, I thought, oh, David, we talk about Denmark, we don't talk about the Netherlands. And in Denmark, you have, the Christmas tree gets the Danish flag, all that stuff which Jan is talking about plays itself out in somewhat related ways, but differently, because it was a corporate system, a neo-corporate system, and the Netherlands was a consociational system. Both of them disintegrated over the last 30 years. And to the benefit of Jan's presentation and the discussion here, empire is mentioned. The brutality of the Dutch, the Belgian empires is not to be underestimated. It really rivals French brutality, right? And the lack of acknowledgement is striking. So I wonder what, thinking about a historical analysis, whether one could reframe the subtitle of your book and saying, how can nativism protect us against liberalism?
Wow. Thanks for these observations. Yeah, so when we were writing the book, often I ask myself, because it is ambitious in the sense that it pretends that even though the Dutch case is highly specific, there is still something there that also at least partly explains what's going on in other countries. And in the book, eventually we choose not to emphasize too much the differences among the countries, which often happens in comparative work, as we know, right? But I was actually very much struck by a lot of similarities, particularly between France and the Netherlands, which, as we all know, in the literature are often proposed as being opposite, right? The Dutch as being a multiculturalist country, and the French as being Republican, etc. So yes, a historical contingency, very much so. And Denmark is mentioned by passing, but is a point in case because if you do a better job than we did, so a more systematic comparison of the rise of nativism in many countries, we can get closer to a kind of explanation what type of nativism or what kind of cleavages are colored by nativism in which countries. Denmark being, of course, not only neo-corporatist, but also being far more homogeneous than the Dutch, right? I mean, not being a colonial power, having been white till very recent, having one religion, right? So the fact that Denmark has become even more nativist than the Netherlands, I would think that that's actually true, can be explained by those particularities, whereas the Dutch case is an exemplary case to the extent that it is surprising, perhaps for some of us as observers of the Netherlands as a progressive and liberal country. But one could argue that actually the Netherlands has more, not a tradition of tolerance, but was a country of minorities. And the question is for the Dutch then whether that tradition that was somewhere there, because the Protestant and Roman Catholics were both a minority, so totally different situation than in Denmark, whether that might explain why there is intolerance, but that some left-wing people at least still think that they have to tolerate differences, right? So it is slightly more of a nuanced picture there. I'm not sure I have an answer to your suggestion for the subtitle, because why would you think then, I think I understand why you suggested, but are there no other means to save us from, and do you mean this liberalism, political liberalism, or then more like neoliberalism, or?
I leave that to you, because you made a very elaborate disaggregation of the concept of nativism. So I'm sure given another half hour, you could do that. But the politics of political regimes which have disintegrated, where all these little things are floating around. You said 19 parties in parliament, right?
Yeah.
It's a different kind of politics.
Yeah.
And being against, whether it's against nativism or against liberalism, is probably the easiest way for those political systems to cohere in a new pattern.
Yeah. I will indeed be short, because we try to analyze, as I said, right, in the book, all kind of explanations for why there is this rise. And not that you are suggesting that, but very often people think, okay, the numbers of migrants, all these kind of things are an explanation. And we show that that's not true, and that France not welcoming Syrian refugees, Germany 1 million, well receiving slightly less nativist, at least till now, than the French. So we show that many of those explanations are not true. And then the question is, okay, there is this instability, there is this longing for the past. But why is the nativist discourse then the most convincing? Why would that be convincing for people? And I think we don't have an answer to that, actually. Why is the story of the left not about equality, about redistribution, about recognition, about seeing each other, to quote Michel Lemond? Why is that not an appealing story? And I have a totally circular reasoning there. So the success of the radical right is the success of the radical right. I don't see structural developments that explain actually why nativism is the winner at this moment. So that is a very weak argument. I'm very much aware of that, but I'm very open to ideas. Why then those nativist ideas that are so exclusionary, why those are then so appealing to people, right? But perhaps we go into development psychology there, or the breakdown of regimes. That's also an interesting.
Sorry. Rachel had her hand up.
Thank you so much for this. So I want to take up one of the questions that you also kind of posed in the beginning that you could maybe come back to. And it builds a little bit on the conversation about political and historical contingency. So the rise of the right-wing nativism, do you think its causes vary from this set of cases? Are they general trends that are causing this kind of global surge? Or do you think there are historical contingencies that shape both the rise in each country in different ways? You know, is the what's happening in India quite different than the US, than Netherlands? And are those historical contingencies also blocking or constraining factors as you raise in terms of the potential in the US around the anti-Black racism history, for example?
Yeah, so what we eventually conclude is that obviously it's possible to pin down a couple of factors that seems to contribute a lot. Perhaps we can even say there seems to be kind of necessary conditions. but not sufficient to explain. And there again, it will be more about historical contingency. So there are different additional factors per country. But obviously, the rise and the success of neoliberalism, the dismantling of the welfare state, speaking more about the Western countries, but more in general, the rising inequality in the world, almost everywhere, right? Or perhaps everywhere. Those are very basic trends that might somewhat help to explain. But I'm very hesitant how to, because there are, I mean, the Netherlands still is a welfare state, right? And cannot be compared with the US or with other countries. So it is a factor for sure. And we do see, somebody asked about welfare state chauvinism, that is an important aspect, right? So economic questions of distribution are culturalized or ethnicized or are put in a nativist perspective. So those cultural developments are important, but I'm not convinced just by socioeconomic explanation of the rise of nativism. And I welcome very much, and I'm not a specialist on Russia or on Latin America or on what's happening in India, for instance. And again, migration plays a role, but not in terms of hard numbers. So people feel threatened to a certain extent, but it's not because social media show us that the world comes to us. And this kind of sociological theories I'm not very convinced by, to be honest. No, so there are a couple of things that explain why people are looking desperately sometimes to be reassured. But then again, there are many stories that can reassure you, right? So why would then the nativist story be the most convincing?
Oh, okay, I see two hands, but I don't really know your name. Paul and, I'm sorry?
Abigail.
Okay, so Paul had I saw his hand first and then Abigail. Paul.
Thank you for your talk. I'm not a European expert, but I found it very interesting to hear more about the Dutch case and compare it to the US. And I'm curious about causes for the attractiveness of nativism, which we've just been talking about. And in the US context, I think one of the underappreciated explanations is the hollowing out of civil society over the last 50 years. And with that, including a very broad take on civil society, almost, I would call it like local community and organizational, both formal and informal participation. And with that, basically autonomization of people. We've seen, just informal social gatherings plummet, church membership go way down. So people are spending less time within the civil society space. And so I'm curious if you've observed similar trends. We talked about church membership and, is there actually really meaningful participation taking place, and whether people are able to express their thoughts and have meaningful dialogue, especially at a local level, within different civil society spaces. And if that the trend has mirrored that of the United States and Western Europe, and if you think that has ramifications for the nativism of people.
Yeah, I would say that I would have answered the question a couple of months ago, perhaps in a different way, that I would have answered then more like that in Western Europe, people in rural areas feel less left behind than in the US and in the Middle West and so on. So I'm deeply influenced by the work of Arie Hochschild, right? So what she's writing about emotions people experience in places where, well, the terrible economic situation and migrants coming in, etc. But more recently, we do see actually quite some mobilization by what are called farmers' parties. There are barely any farmers left in the Netherlands. Only 2% of the population is a farmer. But the idea of this nostalgic is mobilizable also in a highly densely populated, urbanized country as the Netherlands, right? So it is very much about cultural ideas. It is very much about cultural images in that sense. Whereas you correctly, of course, are also talking about objective developments, more the Putnam kind of argumentation, like what's happening to civil society. There, empirically, it's more complex, I would say. I mean, we do see new forms of organization and mobilization. We do actually see in many countries a high level of mobilization by citizens. And ironically, there are many more people who perceive themselves now as political competent by the rise of the radical right. Because people, you can say that the rise of the radical right as I already said, right, reintroduce people into politics who didn't care so much about politics. And you can even say perhaps that it is a sign of emancipation. I mean, that is a very positive reading, but that those who really were dropped out are actually, again, voting, right? And organizing themselves. But that's not a sufficient answer to your question, because we do also see, of course, the drop in membership of political parties in almost all countries, right? So that is a factor, but it isn't to say that political demands are not articulated in a different way by social movements and all other kind of new political mobilizations. So again, it is a mixed picture. And it is not true that in countries with the lowest level of political party membership, nativism is the highest. I mean, all those kind of direct correlations, let alone causation, is not there.
I actually joined the rural and this and the ability to sort of get together. I in a parking lot on a van in Ithaca, right here, and I didn't take a picture of it because I thought I'd be doing exactly what they said. A woman with a lot of American flags on it had this sort of sign or poster in the back. It said, how many ways are you going to find, how many new ways are you going to find to show contempt for me today? And it was, I felt it was a message to all of us of the town, of the gown here. And says, I mean, that's political discourse in a very, okay, Abigail.
Where do you find hope?
Good question.
Yeah, well, actually, so this is now speaking on behalf of Tim mostly, but actually in local communities. So he's describing civil society in Vancouver and how people were able there. I don't know how romanticized it is, but it reads as a very convincing story about how people across divides are collaborating on very specific issues in the city they all care for. And obviously that is the question that we have to raise, right? So it's not just about being tolerant, but also whether you can even mobilize with people, because there are topics that are important for all of us. One would think that global warming is such a thing, but there again, we already see that it is, at least in the Netherlands, in many countries, polarizing and not taken seriously by one of the political sides. But the story of hope is very much local and about local mobilizations and people finding each other. So, yeah, I'm not totally convinced myself of the one chapter, but it is about the idea that proximity still counts a lot. And that you have to sit down with people and you have to feel acknowledged. And well, I was just in Boston and I presented the book at the Center of European Studies. And as you might know, Michel Lamont has a new book out on seeing others. It's just out, and that is exactly about this issue. So what is it to see others? Continuing her work about recognition. And not opposing that to redistribution, right? But recognition, all types of recognition that we all need, but that indeed is not content. Exactly. It is that people feel seen by us as well. And that is quite a task for liberals, let's say. Yeah.
I think does anybody have a final quick question? I would have many, but as most people can see, my voice is draining here. So I think on that note, we'll have to thank you for this very stimulating
But I can do it, but I would be perhaps tomorrow morning or time.
I know.
What did you like?
Very.
That is just.